Hi everyone, it's Ren here, and in this video I will be talking about the politics of Nietzsche, and more specifically where do I think that Nietzsche would have stood politically, say like in the current era. I hadn't initially planned to make a third video on Nietzsche, but based on a lot of really interesting comments that I got from my previous videos, I realized that there was this kind of either concern or unease about Nietzsche and about the fact that despite his really interesting contribution to the history of philosophy, some people seem to think that he is bound to be like a sort of far-right person, far-right activist in disguise. And in this video I will be discussing that and the general idea that I have of what could be his politics. So I will begin by basically claiming in this video, and you can tell me what you think in the comments. I'll contest the idea that Nietzsche would be a right-winger today, right? But I equally contest that he would be a left-winger. So be reassured if you were afraid that I was going to make the claim that he was a left-winger. No, I contest that too. But it has to be said, a lot of people would claim that he is a right-wing ideologically. But there are definitely people that I know, people who know their philosophy well, in France and elsewhere, that have a more left-wing approach to Nietzsche. And although it is hard to understand at first, I think that an argument can be made for that too. So really, it fundamentally depends on how you understand the right and the left, I guess. I think that if we define the left, if we define the left as like the Marxist left, and we just say like that's what the left is, or the feminist left, depending on what your perspective is, you will say, well, obviously Nietzsche is an individualist. Nietzsche had not so nice things to say about women, therefore he cannot be left-wing. And if you take the right, a right-winger as sort of being somebody who promotes individualism and who hates equality, then you might find some resonance in the works of Nietzsche to support the point made that Nietzsche is more aligned with the right. But do notice that in a sense these definitions are a little bit like caricatures, I think, of what being left-wing means and also what being right-wing means, It's not like all people on the left are like Marxist egalitarians and people on the right are rich individualists who want to crush people who are poorer than them or like less accomplished. These are exaggerations, I think, simplistic definitions of what right and left mean. And it's only really if we have those definitions in mind, I think, that Nietzsche is going to come across as more of a right-leaning philosopher. So what I suggest is that we take a different interpretation of right and left. We could say, for example, that being right-wing means more or less, by and large, being conservative, thinking that like certain things have to be preserved in society, people who are not necessarily in favor of like transformational change. Whereas I think people who are generally left-wing are people who welcome reform. If you like, the motto of a person's life, if it is more towards reform and constant change and exploring of new possibilities in the political sphere, I think that makes you more left-wing. Whereas if you're somebody who has more of a conservative behavior, wanting to stay in touch with your roots, national roots, cultural roots, religious roots, somebody who has more respect for that, someone, not necessarily respect, but somebody who places more emphasis on keeping the good things and being in touch with what we inherited as part of a community, versus people who are in touch more with how to change that. So a sort of radical, if you like, the radical sort of interpretation of the left would not be necessarily like radical in the sense of being revolutionary Marxist, but more in the sense of simply having an approach to politics that consists in constantly trying to push forward into new territories, not being content with even the good things. And that could be a critique that's made by the right against the left, is that sometimes when things are working well, solidly established through millennia, why change them? That could be dangerous, right? So if we take that definition, which I think is, obviously it can be contested as a definition, but if we take that definition of right and left, then it becomes, I think, maybe a bit more clear why Nietzsche belongs to neither. Because if you really pay close attention, he hates nationalism, which is also something that's associated with the right, but which in fact is not nationalism or being, or patriotism is not necessarily impossible to reconcile with the left. But let's say that, Nietzsche hated nationalism. He would have hated Nazism. That's there's no doubt about it, because it incarnates the herd movement that he so despised. He promoted the strength of the individual for himself or herself or themselves. But he would have hated nationalism. He would probably have been somebody who wanted to shake things up all the time. A little bit like what I suggested in my definition of the left, the constant movement, not being happy with the status quo, being revolutionary in a neutral sense, not revolutionary in a pejorative sense, revolutionary in a neutral sense, having a revolution to the status quo, not keeping things. I don't think Nietzsche would have been happy with having a state of affairs, writing his books, having his books work, apply to society, and then he'd be like, okay, that's my ideas, my right-wing ideas. We return to an earlier age where, there are aristocrats and people who control society and blah, 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 and the weak have to obey the strong. He would, first of all, that's a complete defacement of the philosophy of Nietzsche, but I think that he would probably have, regardless of what happened, he would have continued to shake things up, because fundamentally, what Nietzsche promotes is what I called in my previous video, and what he always talks about, the revaluation of all values. But it's not just a goal that is achieved and then it's over. It's a culture for Nietzsche to constantly be on the lookout for values that we inherited without critically looking at them, without wondering whether they're good or bad for us, just obeying them. We need to question those values all the time. But what kind of conservative person, what kind of right-wing conservative person would be in favor of revaluating all values? Marriage, all the different traditions that conservative people care about a lot. Nietzsche would have contested all of that, right? And it's not, it is not a surprise that Nietzsche was such a massive influence on somebody who is now seen as an icon of the radical left. Actually, I saw that in a video by Jordan Peterson, a guy that I don't particularly agree with and everything, but I think that he's kind of a smart, interesting guy in some respects. And it's really interesting because Peterson seems to have a somewhat I don't want to say it's a caricature of a view of a radical left. I don't agree with him, but he has his view anyway. But it's really interesting because he says that he would like to do a series of lectures on icons of the radical left, and he cites Foucault, right? And at the same time, it seems clear that Peterson considers Nietzsche to be a very influential thinker on his own thinking, Not to mention that Nietzsche had a massive influence on Carl Jung, who is massively influential on Peterson. So you see that a guy who would probably identify as a conservative, I based on what I see, based on what I saw from his videos, I would have to assume he's a conservative, and that's not a bad word, again, let me be clear. He is very influenced by Nietzsche, but at the same time, he wants to fight against the radical lefts, who are themselves influenced by Foucault, who said at some point in his life, I am a Nietzschean. Because Foucault contested and wrote against like all these different organs that, for like from his point of view, these like centers of power that are not the traditionally scrutinized and criticized centers of power, like hospitals, schools, etc., prisons, and see what are the webs of norms, the networks of norms that articulate them and allow them to exert power over people. But that is like very, very, very Nietzschean. It's a very Nietzschean critical approach to looking at society, and that comes from a guy who tends to be seen as right-wing. And like Foucault himself is seen as an icon of the radical left. At least I learned that's what's the case. That's the interpretation on across the pond, because it's true that just like Nietzsche, I think over here Foucault is seen as like sort of halfway between, like some people see him as really left-wing potentially, and other people are like, yeah, it's really hard. He's definitely not a Marxist. He was not a Marxist. He was not really a postmodernist. Like it's hard to I think Foucault's political identity is in fact just as fluid as that of his master Nietzsche. And of course, the left will always say, well, Nietzsche is a hardline individualist. He's not for equality. Like he's an individualist, and he would be ferociously against the notion of equality. I mean, that's enough. That's really enough to drive the point home that he cannot be seen as a left-wing thinker. But like I said, even though he's not this kind of left-wing thinker, he's still for some kind of revolution. He's still for shaking things up in a more left-wing sense than the conservatism of the right wing. When the right wing wants to shake things up, usually it's a reactionary kind of shaking things up. It's a more like returning to an older order that was functioning better. If things have changed so much that like they really despise what they're seeing, revolutionary change would have to happen according to them, but it would still be aiming for something that's already familiar, known to have worked in their opinion. Then that's what's reactionary about the attitude, conservative about the attitude. Whereas for Nietzsche, was totally plunging into the unknown, wanting to reform society, but in an individual manner, and promoting the freedom of the individual against the state, which can be seen as either right-wing or left-wing. And so that's why we end up in situations like the one I just quoted, a guy who is conservative and is heavily, or I think, influenced by Nietzsche, combats an icon of the left, a radical left, that is himself a Nietzschean, called himself a Nietzschean. So Nietzsche, neither left-wing, against equality, pure individualist, nor right-wing. Definitely not a conservative thinker. If you read Nietzsche closely, you cannot say that he is a conservative thinker. He is a revolutionary thinker, but a unique one. Neither right nor left. All right, let me know what you think. Maybe you'll be in complete disagreement with me, but I just wanted to, make a bold argument here to see what happens in the discussion. See you guys.